Private Eye has been reporting in the last issue or two about a private forensics firm called Randox, where hundreds, possibly thousands of forensics test results have recently been called into question. Unfortunately, Randox and its troubles are symptomatic of a wider problem affecting the entire forensics industry and has been ever since the government axed the world-class Forensic Science Service in 2011. Here is Jane Mackenzie explaining exactly what went on at Randox.
There are question marks over hundreds of samples from that lab from police forces all around the country because this lab was taking in samples from all over the place. And this includes people who are already serving jail time, cases that are upcoming and have now had to be adjourned while things are retested. And what's fortunate is that it's about the manipulation of the results, not the samples themselves. So the samples still exist to be retested by someone else.
So this is a private firm, Randox?
This is a private company, yes, which is one of the many contractors who've taken over doing the testing of various kinds of samples for police forces or for defence teams. Sometimes there are cases in the civil courts that need evidence testing.
And do we know how things went wrong at Randox? Do we know why these...
And there's a criminal investigation ongoing, so we can't really go into the details of what's happened there.
OK. But what we do know and what we can say is that hundreds of these samples are going to have to be retested.
Retested, yes.
OK.
Yeah, it affects police forces all over the place.
And the lab is in Manchester.
The lab is in Manchester and is a lab we had written about under a different incarnation when it was doing drug and paternity testing for the family courts some years ago. And there were some serious issues they were having with contaminated results at the time. In terms of allowing people access to their children, which were criticised by a judge.
But then the lab changed incarnation. Was it bought by someone else? It was bought by Randox?
Yes, it was bought by Randox, but it's sort of as a going business, so it's the same lab, just under different ownership.
So this lab has clearly potentially made hundreds of mistakes, and there's so much that's going to need to be ironed out. Is it possible that people are in prison now who shouldn't be?
Yes, it is, yeah. Cases will have to be reviewed depending on the retesting process, but yes. Since it largely relates to driving matters, there'll be people who have lost their licences and jobs because of this kind of thing.
Right.
The Eye's been writing about forensic science for a long, long time, not least because we cover a lot of miscarriage of justice cases, and a lot of miscarriage of justice cases have hung on forensic evidence, so we've sort of had a very long interest in this. Time was, all forensic testing was being done by the state. So early days, there was the Office of the Government Chemist and various police laboratories who did work. And they developed an awful lot of the kind of forensic testing you see, from fingerprint testing through DNA testing, all that kind of thing, were done by a state body.
And that was called the Forensic Science Service?
That became called the Forensic Science Service. Okay. It went through various incarnations.
So you've got one body which does all the testing.
Can do it independently, so it's not the police themselves testing things that they're seeking to balance a conviction on. Defence teams could also approach them for work to be done and so forth.
How do we get from having the Forensic Science Service to having Randox?
Well, governments of various stripes went through periods of thinking, oh, there's an asset we could sell off, or there's something which is doing a business service, so a police force is paying them to do a test. And some of them become very production line tests. So you need your DNA sample testing, it gets tested, the results come back. It looks like quite a saleable thing. So the initial thing that was done was it was turned into a GovCo. So it became a company, but that was owned by the government. And it continued in that guise from 2005 until sort of 2010, 2011, when it started to be looked at again.
And so when it's a GovCo, police forces are paying it with government money, taxpayers' money.
That's right.
Whatever you want to call it. So it's taking that money in, but it's also obviously spending the money on its work and on paying staff.
And importantly, on research.
Right.
So that it can do better testing in the future. But yes, so it has clients both being the police, CPS, the defence sides, and police forces elsewhere in the world were all using that company that was owned by the government.
So now it's 2010/11.
Which is when it sort of starts being discussed that, oh no, it's losing money. and it was losing about £2 million a month, which ministers were sort of, this is terrible, this is a time of austerity, we could be saving £2 million a month by not having losses. Compared to the scale of what they were doing, this really wasn't an awful lot for the taxpayer to be putting in to make good and better forensic science happen, especially because what the criminals are doing doesn't stop changing. You can't just stick with doing the same tests all the time. There's new things that need forensics doing.
Okay, and as you say, it was world class.
Yeah.
Envy of lots of other countries which don't have decent forensics outfits.
Yes.
So the Forensic Science Service losing £2 million a month, or alternative, having £2 million a month spent on it.
Yes.
So it was chopped?
Yes. So they closed it down and said, that's fine, the private sector will take all the burden of this work. Yes.
But how did that manifest itself? Because there were private firms before, I guess, doing forensics.
There were, absolutely.
Okay.
Some of them were quite keen to start sort of taking on some of the Forensic Science Services work, especially the kind of really production-liney things like doing maybe drug testing or basic chemistry. We can tell you the results. They were quite in favour of taking on that work. Less in favour of taking on the maintaining the enormous archive of back cases or sort of developing really fiddly and complicated tests that take staff time and cost money.
It is fascinating the way the decision was made, and we reported this in 2011. So the advice to privatise and to disband the FSS, basically, was the recommendation of a man called Gordon Wasserman, who himself had run a private forensic science company and had worked as a civil servant under the previous Conservative government, and at that time instigated the charging of police services for forensics. So he was kind of opening the door to privatisation or commercialisation a little bit, but it doesn't seem to have had a really thorough review before the decision was taken.
Indeed, and some of the people who weren't consulted is an interesting point, because the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor wasn't asked for their view. Who they were choosing to listen to was very telling.
So it was chopped. Mm-hmm. Private sector takes the strain?
To some extent. A lot of police forces also took work in-house rather than go to a private company. They decided, well, we'll just test things here instead.
Did they have to set up their own labs to do that?
Yes. I mean, some of them already had labs that they could do the very sort of quick things, and then only if they needed to go to the next stage, they were sending it to the FSS. So the Metropolitan Police, because it's so huge, has always had a science facility.
But then again, there'll be some smaller forces which will have had to set up shop.
Yeah. And we're having to then send all of their work out to private companies. You
mentioned that the FSS, as it was independent. So obviously, if the police really want to get a conviction, they can't do anything. They just get the results.
It's independent of the police.
Yeah.
They're just going to give you the results. And they'll come and give evidence in court as independent experts too.
Has that led to any difficulties since the FSS was disbanded? Or is there a potential risk that there could be?
Yes, because a lot more police are doing a lot more in-house testing. Yes, there becomes a question mark over, who is the independent expert that's going to tell the jury, well, we tested it like this, and these are the faults of the testing process, and these are the degree to which we can't tell this. I mean, there's a really strong tendency of juries to believe in scientific evidence.
Right.
If somebody says, well, we tested this and it was a match, it's very difficult to also get through their heads. A match means it's maybe like 40-60 as to whether it was really them. Juries do like science evidence.
Yeah, because of CSI.
Yes.
And do we know anything about the way the cost has changed in the last 6 years?
What forensic science is doing has changed massively in the last 6 years. In some ways, the market has massively shrunk for the kind of old-style biology, chemistry testing services. For instance, because burglary has become massively unfashionable, there aren't the same kind of finding DNA traces around somebody's house tests needing doing it the same way. Because that was certainly one of the big sort of jobs in, say, the 1990s. When I was a local paper reporter, I remember covering the first case that I'd sort of heard about DNA evidence having caught somebody, and it was a burglar who, while burgling, had been having a smoke, dropped the cigarette butt, and they got the DNA from his saliva. And everybody in the courtroom was all like, ooh, how very CSI.
Right.
That kind of case isn't sort of nearly so much of a part of the work of forensic science anymore. And it's far more digital forensics. So it's taking apart a mobile phone or a laptop and looking at, it's a more computer science than biology.
Is that still forensics if you're not going through someone's saliva?
It is. That is digital forensics.
Okay.
And that has become a much bigger part of the field now. And a lot of types of crime have shrunk. So there is less testing, less of the production line testing. So the private business side of things has shrunk, and firms are finding it quite difficult to be able to provide the work.
And so what happens when a private firm, for example, goes out of business? They've presumably got an archive of the local area or everyone who's put work through their firm.
Yep. And this is something that was flagged up in the House of Commons Select Committee last year, was that there is a risk where lengthy data sets that have been in private companies' hands are no longer available if that company goes under. As I recall, there isn't a legal provision for that to be sent somewhere else to be held on to.
If only there was some kind of cross-national body which collected all the data sets from everywhere.
Indeed. Well, maybe there will be again, because at the moment the National Council of Police Chiefs is trying to push for a national joint forensics and biometrics service. It sounds weirdly familiar.
It does.
But they are pushing for the sort of rebuilding of a national body that can sort of oversee the forensics work.
Oh my goodness. So the whole thing, if that happens, will have been for nothing.
It will be a sort of massive cycle of nonsense and overspending on things that could have all continued being done properly and sort of developed in response to the needs of the criminal justice system. But instead, it's been more about the needs of government to look like it was privatising things to save fiddly tiny amounts of money.
Jane Mackenzie. That's it for this week's episode of Page 94. We will be back again next time with another episode. Until then, my thanks to my guests, Richard Brooks and Jane Mackenzie. And if you would like more of the stories that we have been talking about before the next episode, you can get them all in Private Eye. It's on newsstands now, and it's a very good read. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.